There's a fascinating story in the New York Times today by my colleagues Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan, and it deals with some internal deliberations in the Trump administration last year, both when it comes to the deportation of immigrants and responses to protests, especially protests in Minnesota. And what Haberman and Swan find, this is part of their upcoming book, is the extent to which the administration was contemplating far more radical steps than they actually took. Now, they took pretty radical steps. The administration attempted to remove people from the country without any sort of due process in direct violation of the Fifth and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. And with regards to the protests in Minnesota, their heavy handed and draconian crackdown resulted in the deaths of two people. They killed two people, Renee Good and Alex Preddy. What we learn from this, however, is that first, the administration, with regards to deportations, was contemplating the suspension of habeas corpus altogether when it came to immigrants. Now, habeas corpus is basically an ancient Anglo legal principle that is a bedrock part of Anglo American jurisprudence, which holds that you have a right to demand that the government prove why you are in custody or why someone else is in custody. The government has to explain why. They have to prove that someone has done something to justify being held in custody. That is what filing a writ of habeas corpus is. It is making a demand on the state to explain and prove why they've held someone. It really is foundational, just a vital part of the jurisprudential tradition in which we live. The Constitution allows for Congress to be able to suspend habeas corpus in times of war or rebellion, and famously or infamously, depending on where you're standing, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in 1861 when Congress was on recess, doing so in response to the mounting rebellion. He then went back to Congress and asked Congress to authorize a suspension of habeas corpus, which it did. The broad consensus is that only Congress can suspend habeas corpus. It's that fundamental. But the administration was contemplating a unilateral suspension of habeas corpus so that it could seize immigrants and whisk them away to foreign countries, to foreign prisons, infamously the Sicat prison in El Salvador, without any kind of legal remedy from those who have been seized. Now, we know this because a lawyer for the White House, perhaps a lawyer who's hoping that they could still have a career after all of this is over, wrote a memo, a secret memo, don't worry. He wrote the memo specifically to make sure that he was covered, warning the administration, warning the president against taking this step. And Trump, not to his credit, but Trump did not take this step, although he was urged to do so by Stephen Miller. The other part of this is after the shooting of Alex Preddy, J.D. Vance, the vice president, urged the president to invoke the Insurrection Act with the explicit goal of cracking down on protesters and demonstrating to protesters nationwide that there's nothing they can do to impede an ICE operation. Now, the Insurrection Act, if you do not know what it is, allows the president to deploy the military in limited and specific situations. It's been invoked only once in like the last 30 or 40 years, and that was by George H.W. Bush in the wake of the LA riots. And it was invoked through requests from the governor of California. It is one of those tools that is used extremely sparingly because of long-standing legal and cultural prohibitions against using the military on American soil. But Trump has always conceived of the Insurrection Act as sort of an I win button for politics. That once he uses it, his opposition will thus melt away. And J.D. Vance apparently sees it the same way. He thought that if the president used it, maybe left some bodies in the streets, then his opposition will get out of his way. I bring all of this up for two reasons, because I found it fascinating. First, I found it fascinating the degree to which the administration was planning some real deal hardcore despotic moves, or at least contemplating them. That would be suspension of habeas corpus in the absence of any kind of war or civil conflict or whatsoever. And because it shows that the driving force or the driving forces for the administration's most vicious authoritarianism are, in fact, Stephen Miller, which we knew, and J.D. Vance. And it is not so much that Trump is a voice of reason in any of this, that is far from the case, but he seems to have just enough awareness of the importance of public opinion, just enough attentiveness to how these things might look, that he's hesitant to really go all the way through with them for fear of alienating people already more than he has. Miller, we know, is a cuckoo bananas ideologue who genuinely would tear the Constitution to pieces if you gave him a chance, who believes that winning the election was a kind of enabling act for a straight up repressive authoritarian regime centered on trying to expel basically as many immigrants and non whites as possible, and that he would have used this authority if he could get his hands on it. The most interesting thing in all of this is Vance, who I've always read as being a fundamentally hollow person who has no beliefs, who'll say anything to get to power, who is, as I've said many times, a contemptible little pig man. He's a little pig man, pig man, pig man. He's a little pig man, J.D. Vance. He's a little pig man. But what this story seems to suggest is that Vance too is something very much of an ideologue, a sincere one, and that Vance too has the same kind of authoritarian streak that Miller does, and that Vance too is more than happy to see bodies in the streets if it can help him achieve a particular ideological goal. There are suggestions too that Vance's information environment is completely ruined, that he is soaking in the most extremist kind of rhetoric and media environment as you can imagine, and that his ideas are shaped very fundamentally by this extremist conspiratorial worldview. I recall the Vanity Fair interview with Susie Wiles, where she said that Vance was really heavy into conspiracy stuff. I think this is all part of a piece, that he has a conspiratorial and starkly ideological worldview. The other thing I'll note before I wrap this up, just a series of observations, is that this is the second story from this forthcoming book. The first one relates to Vance's leading role in trying to manage the fallout from the Epstein files. And it occurs to me that whoever is the primary source for this book really does not like J.D. Vance, because neither of these stories paints him in a particularly good light. In fact, they paint him as simultaneously a very craven, very dangerous member of this administration. So, open question: who is leaking on Vance? Is it Marco Rubio, a rival? Who knows? But what I've taken away from both these stories is that if there's someone in the White House beyond Miller who is perhaps pushing for the worst possible choices from this administration, it looks like it is J.D. Vance, which makes the prospect of Trump succumbing to, his age a little more worrisome. Less the end of something than the beginning of something maybe quite a bit more frightening.